Hello. Now I'm going to read a fairy tale from one of the illustrated fairy tales in the Usborne book. Today I've chosen to read The Elves and the Shoemaker. Once a very old shoemaker lived with his wife in a little room above their workshop. Each day the shoemaker drew different shaped shoes on his leather. Then he carefully cut out the shapes with a knife and sewed them together with good strong thread. Next, he stretched the shoe shape over a wooden foot, cut out thick soles, and made holes in them with a huge needle, and finally sewed the soles firmly onto the shoes. People loved watching the shoemaker at work. Nobody passed his workshop without peeking in. What splendid shoes! At the end of the day, there was always a crowd of people waiting to buy his latest shoes. But as the years passed, the crowd outside the workshop grew smaller and smaller. Some days no customers came at all. With very little business, the shoemaker was running out of money. Soon he could only afford enough leather to make one more pair of shoes. He cut out the shoe shape and laid them on his work table. Then he yawned. "I'm too tired to sew these today," he sighed. Early the next morning he went downstairs and stopped in amazement. "Am I dreaming?" he asked himself. There on his table stood a perfect pair of shoes. Someone had neatly sewn up the leather. What's more, they had sewn shiny golden buckles on the front. The shoemaker was baffled. He placed the shoes in his window. Before long, a gentleman came in. "These shoes are divine," he cried. "They sparkle and shine, and they fit like a glove." And he paid for the shoes with a gold coin. Now the shoemaker could afford to make 2 pairs of shoes. As he cut them out, he yawned. "I'll finish them tomorrow," he thought. But by morning, 2 neat pairs of shoes were waiting for him, fancy bows and all. That day, the puzzled shoemaker had 2 more happy customers. Now he had enough money to buy leather for 4 pairs of shoes. After cutting out the leather, the shoemaker went to bed. The next morning, he couldn't believe his luck. On the table stood 4 perfect pairs of shoes. "It must be magic," he cried. And so it went on. The more leather the shoemaker cut, the more shoes he found in the morning. Within weeks, business was booming. The shoemaker was a happy man. He had lots of money and little to do, but he still didn't know where the shoes were coming from. Who do you think is making our shoes?" whispered the shoemaker. "I don't know," said his wife, "but let's find out." That night, instead of going to bed, they hid behind some coats hanging in a corner of the workshop. Everything was quiet until midnight, when 2 little elves rushed in wearing nothing but rags. They sat down at the table and quickly began to sew. They sewed so fast the shoemaker could hardly see their tiny nimble fingers. "What fantastic red boots, even if I do say so myself," said one, admiring his own handiwork. "They're fit for a queen or a very tall elf," said the other. "Hurry up, or we'll be spotted," said the first elf. "I'm almost done," the second replied. Then they polished the boots until they shone and left them on the workshop table. They disappeared through the door and raced up the street. The shoemaker and his wife looked at each other astonished. "I think I'm going crazy," whispered the shoemaker. "Were those really elves?" His wife nodded. "How can we ever repay their kindness?" she wondered. "Perhaps I could give them one of my best cabbage and custard crumbles." "Or we could make them new clothes," said the shoemaker. "What a splendid idea," she replied, and they set to work. The shoemaker made 2 pairs of tiny boots, and his wife spent all day sewing little suits. That night, instead of leaving leather on the table, the shoemaker left 2 piles of clothes. Then he and his wife hid behind the coats again and waited for the elves. The elves were delighted with their new outfits. They scrambled into them and danced and skipped all around the room. "I've never worn shoes before." "Wow, my very own shirt." "How handsome we look," they cried. "We're far too grand to work now." "Come on," said the first elf. "Let's show our friends how fine we look." The elves skipped merrily out of the door. The shoemaker and his wife happily watched them dance up the street. The shoemaker might have lost his magic helpers, but now he had plenty of customers and wonderful ideas for shoes. And as for the elves, they never sewed another shoe. That was always one of my favorite stories when I was a little girl. I hope you enjoyed it. Have a great day.